Old news incoming. Stranger Things Season 1 is amazing. The character arcs and narrative are shown rather than told. It just lets silence, shadows, and bicycles tell their own story. I love its chilling atmosphere, its uncanny ability to make you feel a real sense of discovery and horrified wonder. I actually remember getting chills when the Demogorgon that killed Barb is revealed in the photograph. And then top it all off with that sweet, sweet nostalgia, the music and many references to a time that's unfortunately long since gone, and you get an amazing cinematic story. Now, instead of watching Stranger Things in 2016 like a normal person, I binged the entire series in a month. The way that the tension was built during each episode had me addicted to finding out what happens next, and I just couldn't stop watching. But I couldn't help but notice that the character arcs were becoming repetitive, and the story was becoming more and more of an explanation as to just what in the was going on in Hawkins, Indiana. After the first two seasons, I found the setup to Will and Eleven's characters to be extremely compelling. But I'd like to focus on Will today. His character is sensitive, creative, and a little awkward. Then, there's just a small detail about him being repeatedly traumatized by interdimensional beings. He survives the upside down for a week on nothing but Christmas lights and grit as a child. That's insane considering what we now know what Demogorgons are capable of. And because of the way that his storyline plays out, I believe it's a shining example of the growing problem I was noticing more and more. As my binging went on, my optimism for Will really started to wane. He just kind of shrinks into the background, and that reaches its all time low in season 4, where his agency as a character was limited at best. Still, the writers of Stranger Things have shown me that character writing and the relationship between those characters was the true heart of the show, and why I think the characters became so popular in the first place. So I decided to keep watching, and I waited for the payoff that I knew was supposed to come in season 5. The moment where Will's endurance would finally turn into tangible character growth. And while watching this final season, my frustration reached its breaking point, not with a scream, but with a massive, exasperated sigh. Because when the show finally puts Will's internal struggle front and center, the framing and resolution of his would be arc left me feeling a lot less inspired and a lot more underwhelmed than I think the show ever intended. So let's take a look at his particular scene, talk about what I think was fumbled, and what I humbly think could have been done better. Let's jump right into it. The scene. Just a quick recap. After Will becomes a sorcerer, saves his friends from the Demogorgons, and reunites with this adventuring party, he makes the brave decision to re-enter Vecna's mind, this time using a Demogorgon's body to try to save Max and Holly. Although Will does manage to buy them enough time to escape, he's ultimately captured and tortured once again, forced into the role of Vecna's unwilling spy to reveal Max's location in Hawkins. Will attempts to resist this by clinging to happy memories from a time before fear consumed him, but Vecna easily breaks through this defense by targeting something far more personal: Will's greatest internal fear. After Eleven goes into the Upside Down to rescue him from Vecna's grasp, Will returns to Joyce and tells her what had happened. He realizes that what Vecna showed him wasn't a lie or a trick, it was a deeply rooted fear that came from within himself. That exploited fear is isolation, being abandoned, emotionally exiled, left behind by the people he loves. From that realization, Will concludes that the only way to truly confront Vecna is to face that fear head on by telling the truth, that he is gay. He gathers everyone together and shares his story, ending with a vulnerable admission that his greatest fear was how the people in his life would react to this part of him. As expected, though, his friends and family respond with warmth, reassurance, and immediate acceptance, affirming that his honesty hasn't changed how they see him. The moment brings Will visible relief, easing the emotional burden of repressing his identity and allowing him to find comfort in the fact that being truthful didn't cost him the people he loves. On the surface, this newfound openness seems to grant him a sense of peace, and perhaps even a renewed confidence, as he prepares to face Vecna alongside the group. Wait, he seriously wasn't going to come along? It's obvious where the emotional beats were supposed to land, but instead, the execution of that landing only raises some serious questions about how lasting or earned this growth truly is. Before I get into this too much further, I do want to preface something. I don't think that any one scene is what broke the camel's back. Hyperbolically speaking, it's one of 1,000 paper cuts when it comes to the ending of Stranger Things. I am also not arguing that his scene should be cut out altogether. I actually think Will should have a coming out scene because his story, I think, would have felt incomplete without some form of thematic resolution. Stranger Things starts with so many intriguing themes of being an outcast, confusion over one's identity and belonging, emotional insecurities, and the quiet pain of having to repress one's true identity. And those are all incredible themes to explore that can generate real emotional impact to keep us invested in these characters. This scene in particular is a great example of what happens when a show forgets its roots, i.e., what made it so great. I'm here to explore why, in my view, it didn't have the emotional weight and impact that it really ought to have. In order to understand where this supposed emotional weight should have come from, we need to take a look at the character growth that we were promised. I mentioned that the character arcs in Stranger Things felt cyclical. This is largely due to the fact that the show has a habit of resetting emotional progress between seasons. Many of the character arcs are treated with this, and Will's arc is no exception. The theme of this reset seems to be silent resilience. Look at season 1. Will is a frightened child who's captured, yet through his own ingenuity and the fierce love of his mother, he survives long enough to be rescued. He shows and learns resilience. Season 2 follows up with him struggling with PTSD. He becomes possessed by the mind flayer. He gets used like a tool to make tunnels. The poor kid internalizes the idea that he's being targeted for being the weak one, and his self esteem begins to degrade. He continues on being resilient. Season 3 shifts the conflict even more inward. Will grows apart from his friends as they move on to new interests like surprise girls, a tension that ultimately climaxes with the destruction of one of his only true safe spaces after feeling the loss of another. But then nothing really comes of it afterwards. They don't even really mention Castle Byers again. So it feels like Will just represses another conflict and is resilient. Then finally, in season 4, Will seems to come close to moments where he might finally express his true feeling, only to suppress them again. His encouraging monologue to Mike is truthfully a thinly veiled confession, and Will quietly accepts that his love will be returned. This broken, hard moment could have been a real turning point for Will, as the show seems to want to display here. Instead, it turns out that he was just repressing his feelings again without any kind of personal growth. Because season 5 Will is no different. Robin tells Will that the answer is inside him and he only needs to recognize it. That realization gives him access to Vecna's powers, effectively positioning him as the sorcerer of the group, someone whose abilities come from within rather than an external source. Let's just ignore the fact that someone with innate abilities, for some reason, has to be close to the hive mind in order to do anything at all. The takeaway of this moment here is that Will's strength finally emerges from mental clarity and a growing sense of self worth. But is it though? Because after this momentous plot point, Will gets reset again. He gains these new powers, and shortly thereafter, he's used to spy for Vecna and needs rescuing. The problem starts when he slips back into thinking of himself as useless. He internalizes the villain's taunts and wallows in them. And without any confidence to push back against the fears Vecna exploited, Joyce once again has to swoop in to remind him that weakness and fear isn't his defining trait. By never giving Will his pause to self reflect, his inner confidence and self acceptance never develops or grows in any meaningful and impactful way, even when the show's plot tries to push for it. A person who's resilient, especially in the face of what seems like insurmountable odds, is nothing short of admirable. But when the same person returns to the same baseline emotion of quiet and lonely desperation with no hope of pulling themselves up, the audience isn't watching development. They're watching stagnation because struggles aren't who we are. I agree that we should absolutely be validated for how hard our struggles are, but we are defined by what we choose to do in our times of struggle. Will so far hasn't had compelling shifts in how he sees himself or made any meaningful changes in his agency as one of the core characters of the show. He's a character that's begging for a dramatic change in his presence because showing resilience over and over isn't a destination, it's a journey with no end. And so Stranger Things clearly wants that character development for Will. So they set up a second big scene for him in the most inorganic way, forgetting what the audience and the other characters already know. And so now we reach the shoehorn of the problem. How the scene unfolds is where the impact begins to stumble. Big emotional moments land generally better when they grow out of a clear, organic sequence of events. So not only do characters need to make logical decisions given their circumstances, but the audience should also be able to relate. They should feel like the story naturally arrived through character choices that make sense. Otherwise, the scene is going to seem manufactured or even like a contrivance. I know that sounds harsh. A plot contrivance doesn't necessarily mean that there's no longer any impact or no meaning at all. It's that the plot point only exists to further one very specific narrative goal. It's an attempt to tell us how Will is now a confident man who is now untouchable to Vecna. Unfortunately, how the show goes about trying to tell us falls flat. There's really only one key plot point that is used to trigger Will's big scene. It's his realization about how Vecna uses his powers on his victims, which also leads to Will's fear of how his secret will be met with by the other characters. The problem is that we, the audience, already know about Vecna's powers and how the other characters are going to react to Will's secret. First, let's look at Will's revelation regarding Vecna. Fear Vecna used on him came from within. And if Vecna's power depends on exploiting unresolved internal conflict, then confronting that conflict weakens him. This isn't new information to the audience at all. It isn't even new information to the other characters. That's because the entirety of season 4 already explored how Vecna feeds on fear and internalized conflicts to power his gruesome abilities. In season 4, the four victims are all high schoolers: Chrissy the cheerleader, Patrick the basketball player, Fred the newspaper editor, and our beloved Owen Max. Chrissy struggles with a verbally abusive mother and an eating disorder. Patrick is abused at the hands of his terrible father. Fred feels guilt and fear over the death he caused in a car accident, and Max suffers from survivor's guilt as a result of witnessing her stepbrother's brutal death. They're all existing internal conflicts, and Vecna doesn't ever plant fake trauma or fears into them, and that certainly wasn't what Vecna did to Will either. Max, Lucas, Steve, and Dustin have this figured out halfway through season 4 because they try to find other potential victims by breaking into the school counselor's office. So there's no new information about Vecna's methods. But what about Will's fear? The fear of abandonment. The scene is framed as if Will's fear could be true, but we already know that not one character is going to reject him. And it's because of how much external validation and support Will has already gotten. As far back as season 1 from the year 2016, despite the fact that Will might be queer or different, his mother Joyce would not give up on him. She continued to have hope and believed that Will was going to come home. Jonathan was also portrayed through flashbacks as an incredibly supportive and loving older brother. He shares music with Will and has always shown Will support through his presence alone. Season 2 continued this theme with even more people surrounding him to protect him and help him from the mind flare. In season 3, the show confirms that Mike knew about Will's secret because Mike insensitively blurts out that it's not his fault that Will doesn't like girls. And if that still wasn't enough, season 4 had Jonathan's acceptance of Will. They have a rare scene with both brothers that ends with Jonathan telling Will that he'll love him no matter what. I think it's abundantly clear that Will is surrounded by very loving family and friends that aren't ever going to abandon him despite what they know about him. When the scene is staged as revelation, but functions as confirmation, the potential emotional impact of the arc will fall flat because the manufactured climax can never hope to capture the character development that was needed to tie the arc's ending into a nice big bow. And so finally, we arrive at the crux of the issue, the inner strength that was outsourced. In the context of a story, what is inner strength? Where does it come from? How is it developed? First is self awareness. Understanding yourself is a keystone foundation to self assurance because you can only become a truly grounded person when you understand your flaws. Second, inner strength can grow from just experiencing life. Hardships in particular seem to promote change in many people. Third is agency. You mature when you understand your decisions and take responsibility for them. Acknowledging the consequences of your actions is a great catalyst for growth. Can inner strength be nurtured? Absolutely. It can be bolstered by introspection, like meditation or self reflection. Introspection is a wonderful guide to meaningful changes in agency. It can also be grown from external support. External validation is really important. It can provide boosts to both morale and courage. But external validation alone cannot be the source of true inner strength. If we go back to our recap of Will's theme, he finally breaks down and admits that he's different. He explains what Vecna showed him, his fear of being treated differently, slowly drifting apart from the people he loves, and ultimately ending up alone because of his differences. This is a genuine, real fear, one that many others could empathize and sympathize with. And admitting a fear like this takes a certain amount of bravery. And while that's a wonderful start, it isn't any kind of real transformation. When Will voices his worst fears out loud before everyone, he guarantees a single outcome, one of reassurance. And the show makes the poor decision to frame the forced external validation as the source of Will's newfound confidence. It's a paradox. If his fear, at least at first, would have been Will's private realization, it would have provided the necessary groundwork for an actual change in meaningful agency. Imagine Will sitting with that fear, accepting the risk of what might happen, and then choosing to tell his truth anyway. That newfound bravery, deciding to be honest despite his fear, would have been the seed to Will's new self esteem. By outsourcing Will's inner strength, it further misses the perfect opportunity to tie his inner strength to his new psychic abilities. Mastering his fears would mirror becoming an innately powerful magic wielder. Instead, even his abilities are dependent on his proximity to the hive mind, an external factor, which just undercuts the already struggling character arc of Will. What about all the other stuff? There are some other things I would change as well. I would strictly limit who Will shares his secret with. There's very little emotional weight to be gained from having someone like Kali, number 8, present at this moment. It would feel far more personal if Will confided only in Joyce, Jonathan, Mike, Dustin, and Lucas, the 5 people who matter most to him and have helped shape his struggle throughout the series. Also, Gathering every single character to receive external validation is quite tone deaf to their current predicament. They're in a race against time to stop a world ending event. I don't think making Will feel better is something even half of these characters would have even thought about. I also think there should be a more lighthearted reaction towards Will about his secret. The characters poking fun at Will affectionately about how long they've already known about his sexual preference would be a great change of pace for Will and speak volumes more to him than what we've got. The fact that his core group already knows and fully accepts him would immediately undercut Vecna's greatest weapon. Will could then have a new realization of Vecna's MO. Power born from fear is just manipulation. This scene would expose Vecna's truth for what it really was, a lie born from his inability to accept his own world. The power Vecna held over Will wouldn't be broken by reassurance, but by Will's own realization that he had already been safe all along. That the prison Vecna forms around his victims are indeed lies. Vecna's a hypocrite. Will's newfound courage and growing self confidence is perfectly analogous to Will's transformation into a sorcerer. Will would also gain the space to internalize something he's never truly been allowed to learn, that his weakness was never real, only believed. And in doing so, it would complete the other small arc that began with Robin's advice that the answer was always inside him. In confronting the fear and finding it hollow, Will wouldn't just learn resilience again, he would finally outgrow the role of victim and be someone who can take action and affect the story after all. Will the Wise wouldn't be empowered by proximity to the hive mind, but by reclaiming the part of himself Vecna could no longer touch. And so instead of thematic clarity, I'm left with a limitless frustration because the show forgot something integral. The lack of impact of Will's arc comes from how little his big moment ultimately asks of him as a character. And my frustration is how Stranger Things seemingly forgot how well they used to write character interactions that showed character agency and set up character development all in one fell swoop. Take one of my favorite scenes from the first season when Jonathan chases after Joyce. They get to yelling at each other in the street, Jonathan wanting to pick out a casket for Will and move on, while Joyce is screaming that the body isn't her son and she needs to go to save Will. It's such a nuanced and terrible fight where neither character is villainized, neither is wrong, neither is being weak. Both are expressing their love through their agency. One is of acceptance, while the other is of refusal. They're both trying to fight for their realities, for their truth. It also sets both of these characters up for later in the story. Jonathan, a lonely high schooler, is suddenly forced into growth with the dark reality that his little brother is dead. What begins as resignation and helplessness, he later transitions into a character with the need to fight in order to protect what's important to him. Joyce's arc as a mother is about validation through sanity defying persistence in her belief that her son is still alive. She goes from fear and panic to humiliation to anger into iron resolve. Dynamic and deep storytelling like this is a stark contrast to this finale, and it leaves me with questions like, how is Will's big moment still defined by a fear of losing love when the story began because he was far too loved to ever be lost? I think the harsh reality is that Stranger Things failed to remember its own deep character writing that made it so popular from the start. Like the truth itself, the concept is very simple. How do different characters react to simple truth? What conflicts are incited? And what agencies are exercised in response? Jonathan and Joyce represent how different emotional interpretations create conflict. Will and Vecna could have represented how different ideological interpretations create opposition. Vecna and Will's reactions to fear are thematically inverse of each other. They are arguably each other's greatest opponent, ideologically and pathologically, more so than 11 in many ways. Vecna sees fear as evidence that the world deserves to be restarted, selfishly in his own eye. Will experiences fear as something that is to be shared, faced, and to grow stronger from. They are not opposites because one is afraid and the other is not, but because they draw opposite and conflicting conclusions from the same primal emotion. But instead of exploring what those conflicting truths actually could have meant to Vecna and Will, the show abandons the character driven conflict to what can only be described as an action set piece, a spectacle. Vecna's view on fear didn't really matter because the Mind Flayer was in control. But Vecna also wanted to do what the Mind Flayer wanted, and Will overcame his fear to narrate what was happening in Vecna's mind and stop his arm from killing Eleven so that she could kill Vecna. The show is serviceable with a really broad range of some likable characters. There are shining moments from this most recent season as well. But it is true that somewhere the writing lost track of what was important. I look back at my short but impactful visit to the world of Stranger Things with a bittersweet gnawing in my stomach. The Upside Down was a descent into hell, a place of literal nightmares. Calling it a bridge and then making it a place that you can commute to is a decision that tells you everything about the show's priorities. And I think the characters deserved better.